Welcome, everyone. We'll wait for a couple more people to pour in. So I think we wait 1 or 2 more minutes. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. If you've joined a couple of Searchable webinars, been on the cohort, been on the accelerator, you've seen my face, heard my voice. My name is JP. I lead SEO and AEO at Searchable. I wear a few hats at Searchable, but one of them is working on projects like this, running studies, looking at experiments, and sort of understanding how LLMs work and function. This is going to be a great sort of talk that we're going to take you through today. I'm super excited about it. Spent many weeks doing a lot of research in Claude and other engines. And from this, we're also going to have a sort of follow-up on many exciting things. So I think this is the beginning of many wonderful things. I'm going to kick things off. I will just say that if you have any questions for the Q&A, please can you put them in the Q&A. If you have any self-promotional stuff, rather just don't spam the chat. And we do that out of respect for all the participants because we just want everyone to have as an enjoyable experience as possible. And we will be doing all Q&A at the end. I will try leave a little bit of time so that we can cover that. So I think without that, I just want to see if there's anyone. And yeah, thanks for everyone putting in the chat. It's going to be quite active. I'm going to ask a question a little bit to everybody, so don't be scared. I'm looking forward to typing some answers in there. You can go in, say where you're from, where you're joining from today. It's a pleasure to have everybody with us. Let's see where everybody's joining. We got a couple people. We got someone from Ghana, amazing stuff. I saw UK. Got a bunch of people, Netherlands, Spain, Miami, Canada, Portugal. My goodness, getting a bit jealous. All right, I think with that out of the way, we'll jump straight into it. So we've all came here for the reason today, how to get your brand recommended in Claude. Today, I'm going to be taking you through it. It's going to be broken down into a couple of sections. We're going to be covering a few things. So we're going to be diving deep into Claude as an LLM, understanding what it is, who it matters for, what we see surfacing, how it works behind the scenes, under the hood, how it behaves by different industries, how it relies on its own memory, which is going to be a very interesting section. Claude is a very unique LLM in that sense, where it looks when it does web searches, and ultimately how Claude recommends brands. For this, you will get insights in how it will recommend your own brand. And I hope by the end of this, we hope to deliver a lot of value in terms of your understanding of Claude. I think you will learn a lot from this session if you came here to learn more about Claude today. So when it comes to Claude, and I'm sure, as you know, you've probably had many, many chats with Claude, is that it is really opening up a very short space in the answer. And it is really recommending 3 to 4 brands, okay? And so a good way to do that, as you can see in the subtitle, is really to put in a question either about your own brand or maybe potentially one that would be for your customers, is best option in category. And we've used an example here, best CRMs for small businesses. Now, as you can see what's come up, we have HubSpot, Pipedrive, and Attio. And so I said I would ask you all a question in the chat. This is that moment. Please feel free to answer, but I would like to know, of everyone who's in this webinar, who would take Claude's advice sort of at face value on a topic not related to money, health, life insurance? So we got a nope. We got a couple of yeses, a couple of nopes. Now, I, for one, as a power user, every time, thank you, I appreciate that, making me feel better about asking that question. Obviously, we're very sort of cautious when we do this, but for the most part, we will use it as a starting point, as someone has illustrated there in the question, in the answer, sorry. And we elicit that answer from Claude. But the thing about using LLMs is we have really developed a lot of trust in these things. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, the technology we use is shaped around different UX experiences, and AI is no different. It is designed in such a way to elicit trust. And so what we see here is we see that a lot of trust in the answer. So when we see these three recommendations here, HubSpot, Pipedrive, Attio, whatever the case may be, these are options that are prescribed to us. So we have about 4 to 3 brands that are going to be prescribed to us. Now, every chat is different, whether it's a local chat, whether you're looking for something in particular type of e-commerce, sort of services, whether you're looking for a CRM, whatever the case may be, it is different. But for the most part, you're looking at around 3 to 4 brands. And these are results that are prescribed to you. So it's unlike traditional SEO results where we are free to choose from around 10 blue links, not to mention organic results, not to mention map packs, not to mention people also ask questions, etc. But you're also free to browse 100. So your options are far more vast if just looking at a single Claude chat. And so getting recommended in Claude is huge, especially on a chat. And if you consider that many people will be using it as an LLM. So one thing that you will now discover as we will present, and as we've basically been running some research and studies on Claude across over 90,000 sources, Claude sources, is that over 15 industries, Claude is searching its own memory up to 52% of the time, where no web search or source is being retrieved to shape that answer. And what that means is it's basically deriving that answer from its own memory, what we call parametric memory, which is already held in the model. And this is going to become more and more valuable as I continue to present this to you. So, but on the other hand of that, only 48% of those come from web searches. Okay. And so depending on the type of queries that you're asking, depending on the type of business that you are, there will be a range or a scale of when you will be recommended. And ultimately, it impacts your chances of being represented in a response in Claude. And this is really valuable in the sense that we look at other models like ChatGPT, and I will make some comparisons to other models during this webinar. The ChatGPT searches the web up to 90 to 95% of the time. And so when we look at Claude, it's a very unique model, and where it chooses to derive answers from is very different to other LLMs. And as I said, I will be comparing to other models because that's one of the best ways for us to make comparisons. And so if you look at ChatGPT, as I said, it's here we have 89% or rounded up to 90%. That's how often it searches the web when looking for answers. Sometimes as high as 95%, depending on the types of prompts you ask, the types of queries. Whereas with Claude, it's doing a web search around 48% of the time. And we know this because when we look at these LLMs and how they function, I'm not talking about using API calls, I'm talking about using the actual UI, connecting directly to it with an agent and analyzing the requests that stack and technology and LLM sends out when it's sending out its own queries. We can actually measure those queries, what we call web searches, grounding, and for other means and purposes, query fan out. And so ChatGPT, for the most part, is answering a comparison question from memory around 27% of the time. But when Claude's looking at comparison, so when it's basically looking at comparison, best X for Y, a really valuable part at the middle of the funnel, effectively where a lot of consumer buying decisions are made, that is really coming from memory around 89% of the time to 90% of the time. How often does Claude cite Reddit? Well, I'm sure you've heard in many LLM conversations that Claude cites Reddit. That LLMs rarely reference Reddit. And I'm sure if you've been plugged into recent news, you will have seen there's been a major drop in citations of Reddit recently. Claude almost never sources or cites Reddit, as opposed to ChatGPT that cites it constantly as a source, and it's almost number 2 all of the time. In fact, if you go to Reddit right now and you go reddit.com/robots.txt, you'll see that actually Reddit has blocked all LLMs from crawling its website, which is a whole nother kettle of fish that we won't get into. And so you need to ask yourself that if you want to be visible on Claude, should you be on Reddit? And as you can see by the data that we have here, the answer is likely no. And how often does it cite your own site when it searches? ChatGPT 61% of the time, which means that when it comes to owned media that you own on your website, content that you can produce, whether it's on your blog, whether that's a resource or a guide, or maybe you're looking at a product page or a category page, ChatGPT will use that up to 61% of the time, whereas Claude, it's about 1/3, so 32% of the time. And so what we're seeing and what's starting to develop is that in order to get ranked in Claude, it's really what others say about you, and your own media presence has to be very high. And so I think what we'll start to build a logical argument as we make our way through this deck is in order to really have a quick retrieval place in Claude, really is to get into Claude's memory. And if you're probably asking, oh, well, how do I do that? The hint comes in a lot of the updates that are made. When you look at all the different versions that are released, whether it's Haiku, Opus, Sonnet, Fable, whatever the case may be, these all go through various training paradigms, rounds. Yes, they are built on a core set of training, but ultimately it is an update and it is an algorithmic update. So for comparison queries, Claude is more than 3 times as likely than ChatGPT to answer without searching the web, which means that it really holds an opinion within its own memory before it even has to go and do a web search. In fact, Claude relies on memory much more in some industries than others. And I really wanted to bring this slide together for the audience because I know that everybody comes from a different background, of the attendees that are here today. So when you look at options like software and SaaS, or even go down to, for instance, like local services, you can see there's a very big difference in how Claude is choosing to access those answers. So from top to bottom, at the top, software and SaaS, a lot of that is memory led. It comes from Claude's own parametric memory. Claude has an opinion about these things without even having to do a web search. And so if you're in software and SaaS, up to 66% of the time, it will actually just rely on its own memory, its own training data. As we move further down, for instance, health, you can see it's 63, home and garden, finance, consumer tech, etc., and local services is 4%. So local services would be, plumber near me. And at that point, Claude really does a web search with a query fan out, which is really much lower in Claude. It really does not use that many query fan outs as opposed to ChatGPT. Now, it would be remiss of me to give an exact figure to that because it's different across every prompt, industry, whatever the case may be. But it is far, far less. And when it does it, for instance, if you had to say best plumber in Manchester, it would append best plumber in Manchester, UK, i.e. separating from the UK versus any other place. Now, the reason it's doing that is because local services are far more subject to change, businesses change, addresses, etc. So when you're looking for a near me type query, or sometimes looking for purchase queries at the bottom of the funnel, it is actually doing that in order to retrieve more information so it can almost use its parametric memory or its memory as a hypothesis that it then reinforces when it is deciding to give a final verdict. If you consider making your way down this list from software to health to home and garden, software, if we think of the nature of these industries, software, big industries like CRM, is a purchase decision you really only make a couple of times throughout the course of the business, depending on the lifespan of that business, because you really don't want to change. It's inherent to a business's processes. And so Claude is really building a reputation memory around those things so that it can make a single shot decision and advise its users. Health is exactly the same. Yes, health is always changing and it's different, but if we think about it, there are certain core things about our bodies that remain the same for many, many, many years. And so it's okay to rely on a rather static sort of range of memory, as opposed to looking at consumer tech. If I had to sort of get a new iPhone, and I had to ask what is the best iPhone or the best Android, that will require a lot more modern contemporary insights. And therefore it is, of course, natural and logical that Claude would have to go out and find those things. And of course, I've explained that for local services. The prompts that we put into Claude also elicit different types of responses and will also determine whether it relies on its memory or not. And so what we found through the data that we looked at in the study that we did across the 90,000 sources that were used to form this opinion, not to mention the millions of prompts that we have in our database, is that Claude relies heavily on memory for advice, comparisons, and reviews. Okay, and I will make a caveat with reviews that it will obviously make review searches. And shopping and local questions are much more likely to trigger a search. So when you're talking to Claude, what should I do about a certain situation? And sometimes 98% of the time it relies on pure memory alone. 0 web searches needed. When it's doing comparison queries, which is better X or Y, that's up to 89 to 90% of the time. Is this brand any good? So for a lot of these advice comparison review type queries, it's really in the upper realms of 85%. So it's really high percentile that it's leaning on its own memory. If you're looking at what should I buy or what's near me, i.e. localized searches, we can see that it is quite low as 2%. And that makes sense. And if you look at the actual shape of the prompts that we put into Claude and what is elicited back when you look at the network requests, it brings up certain surfaces. And when I say surfaces, it brings up things like the map pack, right? A surface is, when I say that, I mean it's a digital surface within the UI. And so it will really elicit. If you look at the JSON response, it will have map pack or whatever. And that usually comes from like a localized search. And so that we can really take away from this is that a head-to-head comparison is answered from memory almost 9 times in 10. Now, this is obviously more important when it comes to understanding how these feature into the funnel, the buying funnel, the psychological journey that consumers take when they really look to confirm a purchase using LLMs. So for many consideration requests, Claude may answer without reading the comparison, review, or wires pages that you yourself have created as part of owned media. It's not that all hope is lost. We know that there are other engines that have more users than Claude. ChatGPT is one of them. But Claude is also one of the fastest growing LLMs outside of ChatGPT and Gemini. That is a fact. The data tells us that. And so if you look at the top of funnel discovery, what should I buy? Up to 98% of those answers are coming from pure memory. It often searches, so citations and content can still land. But like I said, it is using that as empirical proof to back up its own hypothesis of what it believes the answer to be based on its memory, based on what it's been trained on. When you look at the middle of the funnel, which is this any good? Which is better? So it's looking at comparing these things and discovering through comparison what is better. 88% of these also come from memory. So it's slightly less. And the shortlist here does form from reputation, what others say about you when you're not in the room, what we call earned media, as opposed to all the things that you're writing about yourself. And I just want to also just sort of pause there slightly in the sense that earned media is incredibly important to feature on Claude, but we have to understand that how earned sources learn about a brand is that we ourselves have to be custodians of the brand. And so, yes, it is important what other sources say about you, but it's what you say about yourself helps other sources learn that about you. So we need to be custodians of our own brands. We need to push our features out there. We need to surface those so other people and publications can learn about them. So we need to consider the citation loop and how we do get brought into sources. And then if you look at the bottom of the funnel, which is a purchase intent or anything local, which is basically a very targeted looking for this particular thing right now, that comes from memory around 27% of the time. Now, the localized searches are far lower. I mean, we look at about 2%. But for the main part there, Claude is going to be searching again because the answer is live. It's out there. There may have been some recent reviews, something may have changed, a business may have moved, closed for a particular day. And so once again, in order to back up that hypothesis that Claude has formed from its training memory, we need to look at that. Okay. When it comes to what we call YMYL, which stands for your money or your life, as you can see in the bottom of the screen here in the subtitle. YMYL, as I'm sure you all know, but I will just reiterate it again, is queries what Google has traditionally considered keywords that have a direct impact on your money or your life. So anything to do with finance, banking, insurance, medical advice. These sorts of queries are far heavily gated and evaluated in the eyes of traditional search engines because, one, they're far more influential in people's lives, as is said in the acronym. And Two, they are very valuable. So if you look at the types of cost per click costs behind keywords related to insurance or medical, they're a lot higher. And so being present in those, one, is more valuable from an organic perspective. And two, having a higher rank or presence in them, of course, means that you will get more traffic or more visibility, which of course will impact more people's lives. And so what we're finding is Claude is actually far more conservative than ChatGPT on these types of queries, in particular health-related questions. And so when it comes to health type prompts, Claude will read around 3 pages, but in many instances will quote fewer than one. Obviously it has to quote at least one, but statistically speaking, that's what the data tells us. It leans on what it already knows and the opinion that it's held, of course, which is formed through many, many iterations of training data. Whereas for ChatGPT, it searches up to 75% of the time and reads up to 16 pages before giving an answer. So Claude reads a lot less. I think if we can take anything from this, and please don't quote me directly on this, we can probably say that Claude's training process is far more rigorous, but in that sense, it can also open up a couple of holes in the sense that if something is incorrect in the training data, it may filter through into the results. And of course, on the other side of that coin, ChatGPT has the option of being a far more recent in the sense that it will do a lot more web searches. And so when we see here is we have two engines, and somewhat they're opposite in terms of the safety instincts on why and YL questions, which is very important because if you're in one of these niches, this will really make sense to you, as I'm sure if you've been doing digital marketing for these particular queries for a long time. So I imagine a lot of this will hit home. And I found this really interesting. Carrying on from that is that even when Claude does search, it only cites some of the pages that it reads. So as we know, Claude is going to do a website roughly 48% of the time, okay? From there, it will read on average around 7 pages per prompt. And from those 7 pages, there'll maybe be 3 pages that it actually quotes, okay? And so what Claude is doing as an LLM is it's leaning far more heavily on its training data, and it's far more reluctant to quote pages that it reads unless it has been properly and thoroughly analyzed and evaluated against its own internal hypothesis. Some might say, would be wanting to say that Claude is more paranoid or cautious, maybe smarter in choosing or selective in who it chooses to speak about and provide to its users. As a user of Claude not almost every day, absolutely every day, I can say that I do feel that. Of course, it is an AI, an LLM, so it does make mistakes some of the time. But I really feel really informed opinion because when I do a lot of research, I do find that it mirrors a lot of what's coming through my chats. I just wanted to pause there and say I'm really glad that people are engaging in the webinar chat. We will be monitoring this, and I'm hoping through the Q&A that I can be able to answer a couple of questions too. So keep on going, and if anything's of interest to you, pop it in the chat. You probably don't realize how much value it adds to us as a company and myself. So keep it up, and thank you very much. What we'll see is in the different industries, and I've put this table here to sort of show you. So we've basically had the 7 pages that it reads, 3 that it quotes, and then of what it reads, it quotes 43% of the time. And then we've also broken this down by different industries. So for home and garden, you can see it reads about 5. And that makes sense, right? Because if we go back to our original slide, when we look at here of how often it actually chooses to talk from memory, for home and garden, it needs to read less because it relies more on its own memory. In terms of what it quotes, you can see exactly that it's much less. And so from here going downwards, we can see of what it reads, it quotes. It'll quote home and garden 53% of the time, consumer tech 47% of the time, finance 43% of the time, and software SaaS 32% of the time. Now, Claude, as we know in terms of a demographic, and this is also, of course, incredibly valuable for everybody on the call, is the demographic of Claude is mainly those who work in finance, technology. We see a lot of sort of programmers, information architects, we see doctors. So these are the type of demographics that are sort of working in Claude. And do with that information what you will, especially based on the industry that you're in. On that note, now we can dive into what shapes Claude's memory. So now we've spoken about how it chooses to answer, and now we'll look at how it's choosing to shape those answers and effectively what that means for your business. And so if we know that Claude is replying to us up to 52% of the time from its own memory, what we can derive from this is that new and changing brands are the easiest for the model to miss. And I will parallel this thought with the concept of entities and why entities are so important. Now, at Searchable, we've spoken about entities for a long time, and we have known that entities are incredibly important. I think one of the, I don't want to say the happiest days, but certainly a happier day when I was at Searchable was the day that I noticed that our entity was picking up and gaining speed. And the reason I am happy about that, one, is because we obviously work in an AI visibility company, but two is because it means that we are really solidifying the brand. And that's super, super important. And so if you think about a brand or an entity that had made it into the training data as part of the parametric memory, if you have new and emerging brands that are coming in now and companies, you can do a search right now. I encourage you to do that. I did it for a new entrant to our industry, and Claude had to do a web search to find them. But when I looked for an incumbent, it did not have to do a web search. And you will see, because if you have web search enabled, it will say, web search is now coming up in Claude. And so effectively, what will be the sort of easiest targets to be missed within Claude? So we have new entrants, literally those that emerged. So as I've literally just said to you there, I encourage you to do a search for a company that you know is that emerged. Even if you're working with a company or if you've just started your own company, do a search for it and see if it comes up in the web search. And so if it's launched since the last model was learned, you may not be in its memory, and it's not permanent, but it is a gap that you can close and potentially close before the next training round. Any rebrands and renames. So this is how the model still remembers you, and it's worth checking, what's coming up there. This is why entities are super important, and all the basics of SEO, i.e. redirects, and effectively having strong entity recognition so that you can submit this in any shape or form, whether it's Wikidata, whether it's having your Wikipedia, using your NAP, i.e. name, address, phone number, etc. If you have challenges to a famous incumbent, number 3, people that are coming in, I literally just did mention this on our most recent example, but that could also be, an issue, or maybe sharing different brand names or brand jacking, that sort of stuff. The memory is more likely to rely on the previous label or brand. And if you have a fast mover, i.e. a new product, a pivot, a new line that's coming out, in terms of product or service, whatever the case may be, that may be something which has not yet been caught up in a parametric memory. Now, you will see this if you do the search, but if you search for something that Claude can't recognize, it will then, as per its own hypothesis and memory training, it will look against its own data and realize that it doesn't have this. So what it will do is it will then go perform a search so that it can educate itself, so to speak. And it does update every training cycle. Now, we don't know when the training cycles are. We know that they are linked to model releases. We also know that there's a corpus of information that always remains relatively the same, but is also updated. Things have to come out of it too. So that's as much as we know as we grow in this very nascent industry. One thing we need to know is that the shortlist often forms before the search starts itself. Claude actually has an idea of what a category leader is, and this is why it relies so much on its memory. So from a sample of 1,000 unbranded buying questions, we looked at the searches the model wrote for itself, and we actually were able to determine that there's a certain amount of brands being looked at for a particular prompt. So if you look at road running shoes with comfort and recovery, Asics, Hoka, Brooks, New Balance, these were all considered to be category leaders. And so those were effectively explored as to say, we know that these are the top leaders in this category, and how do we compare these to new entrants? Okay. And that's also what I want to illustrate with that CRM search where we had Attio, etc. A lot of those coming from memory. And so if you look at best payroll software, for instance, a finance prompt, we have large incumbents coming in like Gusto, QuickBooks, Payroll, ADP, or ergonomic chairs. Herman Miller, Steelcase, and Secret Lab have always been leaders in that space. The brands appearing in those searches are strongly linked to the model's recall. And 1 in 6 internal searches already named a specific brand without it being put in the question, right? And that's very, very important. So up to 1 in 6 times, you have a chance of Claude effectively knowing who you are as a category leader, which came from its own memory, from its own training data, from what we call its parametric memory. Once again, I'll keep emphasizing this, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows what parametric memory is. It's the fancy term we give to Claude's own memory. On the other hand of that, when looking at a random control, a brand will be against a non-category. So a brand and not present in a category, the chance of being mentioned is about 2.6% random baseline. So the chance of being mentioned for a random category is about 2.6%. But for the most part, Claude has an answer 1 in 6 times. It has formed an idea oftentimes of who's a leader in a category before the prompt is run. And that requires a moment to pause and sort of reflect on that, because I realize that can be rather doomsday. Oh no, Claude knows all the stuff about my brand. I will never be featured, etc., etc. But before we get carried away, I've obviously illustrated with many different points that Claude does a lot of web searching. It knows when it may not have information. It's got very quick, memory cache lookup. And so what it does is it will then ground that in its own web searches. Before putting together this webinar, I was chatting with the team, and I think one of the biggest conclusions we came to is that if I were running a brand that I wanted to get featured in Claude almost absolutely until the next update, should we say, I would double to triple down on marketing and growing my branded presence is likely the highest way of getting into that quick retrieval. But for the most part, through the searches that I've encouraged you to run while we're on this call, you will also see that Claude has its own mechanisms of grounding, etc. So the main takeaway here is that the short list of brands and categories can often form in memory even before the search begins. And so I did have a couple of caveats there, and I wanted to also include the slide to say what we can say and what we can't say. So I will sort of be critical on myself at this point in time, as I'm sure you're asking questions, because we can deduce some things from this, but there's also some things that we can't say for certain. So what we can say is we know the shortlist forms in memory, oftentimes before any search. We know that because it can answer literally without doing any searching whatsoever. So that model is literally just running and it's just retrieving things. What we can't say is that being in that memory guarantees you on being in the answer. So that's super important. And I want to just reiterate on that again. Even if you are in the parametric memory of Claude, it doesn't guarantee you that you will win the answer. It doesn't guarantee you will be first. It doesn't guarantee second, third, whatever the case may be. We can say is that you can measure whether you are on it. You can run a series of prompts. You can track whether web searches are done, whether it actually chooses to run a web search. But we can't say that one tactic reliably puts you there. And actually, I'll show you later on, no spoilers, is the search engine where Claude chooses to get its information from treats the entrance to that search engine, especially in the top results, as largely fairly equal. And so being number one doesn't necessarily mean that you will be number one on that search engine, doesn't necessarily mean you'll be number one on Claude. And what we can say is that you can also shape what the model learns about you. We know this because with large categories, people are present. There are a lot of brands, incumbents, etc. and we can't say that you can do it overnight. So like I said, when I was speaking with the team earlier about this particular webinar that we're doing, and I wanted to be featured in Claude, I would really look at the mechanisms to double and triple down on being featured in the memory and effectively getting there. And most importantly, it is important to know that the results can change. And so from a test that we did on our own website, as we are always testing, of course, at Searchable, is that we structured one section of our own website into different question-shaped pages on a recent test that we ran. And within 4 days, the first AI citations had started landing within Claude. And 3 weeks later, those citations had increased in some instances for particular prompts as high as 2.6x. And that, of course, is very promising to see. It also brings back to the citation loop of how do we really get featured into LLMs? By being custodians of our brand, owning what we say about our brand, our products, our features, our reputation, putting that in right content, putting that in the right media relationships, and putting that out to the world. That is effectively marketing, and it's truly how people will learn about us. I'm just going to pause there just to see what's going on in the chatter. Yeah, I think people are hitting the nail on the head. Don't worry. There are a couple of points I'm going to cover now, so I'm just glad to see that the Searchable team is on it. The main point that we find here, and this has always really been a case for LLMs, is what Claude remembers about your brand is shaped by wider reputation. It's really about earned media. As I say, it's about what others say about you when you're not in the room, not about what you say about yourself. It really runs on your reputation as the model absorbs it at that point in time, however long that training took place. And that means it moves on its own training cycles for the most part, right? For the most part, as we said, up to 52% of the time relying on its own memory. And so why this is important is because it really comes down to that entity recognition, or how you choose to describe yourself as a custodian of your own brand. Be described the same way everywhere. It is say in the instance of a platform here and a tool there, just blurs the picture. It's very important to have a very strong brand explainer to say exactly what it is that you do. And so you want to repeat that claim. We are a X platform for Y doing Z, and repeat it consistently using what we know about search, traditional SEO, NAP, name, address, phone number. I will just plug that once again. Having a strong entity, being in publications, doing press releases and digital PR. What you say about on your own website, what is mentioned in UGC, not Reddit, because we know that Claude doesn't check that. But we will never be able to break open the training data and see. You're not going to be able to edit a page on your website and then watch a ranking move. It's effectively not going to work like that. And as we say, you can't just do a lot of owned media and then it's effectively going to change. You really want to be focusing on more holistic, wider marketing and brand presence. And I'm sorry if that's a somewhat sort of vanilla answer. But once again, when we were speaking in preparation for this webinar, I was saying one of the most important things you could do is double, triple, quadruple down on your own branded presence and expanding that. And I think if there was ever a use case to argue more marketing budget, it would be to get involved in one of the largest growing technological trends that we will probably see in our lifetimes, maybe, or have seen up until this point, I will say. To say, oh, I want to get featured into AI, that is my main goal. And so I would invest heavily in marketing, brand partnerships, affiliate, merchandising, press releases, digital PR, whatever the case may be. That is a good enough reason to secure your brand presence and obtain that fast retrieval in these types of LLMs. You can also identify the sources Claude uses in your category. So you can compare the sources Claude cites for you and your competitors by following these 3 steps. So once again, you can look at your prompts. Just wanted to see, and bear with me while I do this, because I actually had an example loaded up and I really just did want to share this with everyone because we had put a bit of time into this. So let me just check if I can find it for you. And sorry that I didn't have this loaded up before. Here we go. Now, as we know, we can of course, do this in Searchable by checking the sources that we have. I've loaded this up. We have some prompts here, and I do a gap analysis. You can, of course, show by excluding HubSpot from the source set. We can see where are the sources that are effectively driving the answers to the prompts that we're measuring, okay? That is a very easy way to do it. And so what you want to do is you want to focus on your prompts, i.e., and as we've covered many times before, and once again, if you don't know how to do that, the AI Search Accelerator will teach you. And that is what we're running at Searchable. Check the sources behind the competitors. So you can check for your own brand, remove your brand from the source set. You can see who it's framing around, where it's getting information from. And then you can compare those two lists, identify the sources, and start to make inlays into effectively getting into those features and those source lists. And this is what we call earned media, really part of a large earned media strategy. If you repeat this across your buying questions, various topics and verticals within your prompt set and in your prompt universe, this will be incredibly valuable. And you can use a platform, for instance, like Searchable in order to do that. But once again, this is about Claude. It's not about us. So speaking of Claude, if you're in these various industries, these are the types of sources you want to get into. So I did a little bit of a screen share there on our platform, but for the most part, if you're in these different industries, this is likely where you want to be. Now, I'm not going to read all of these out, so I'll just take a moment for you to absorb these yourself. But let's just say you're in software SaaS, you want to be in G2, Capterra, etc. For consumer tech, a lot of review websites like Tom's Guide is standing out. In finance, NerdWallet and Forbes, of course. Home and garden, the category review site or merchandising. And the move that you have here, or the strategy, is also how you will frame that approach. And so if you're in software and SaaS, you'll see for G2, for instance, you want to get featured in the listicles or the roundups. Consumer tech, you want to get your product tested. And of course, those websites do offer testing opportunities, and you can reach out to them and you can organize that. There are a number of strategies that we put together here. So I'll just pause there while you absorb this. But most importantly, depending on which industry you operate in, different sources are used. And for the most part, where it came to SEO, where we focused on, just trying to get in Google, here we're trying to get in many different sources. If you're looking at citation tracking alone, it will miss answers from Claude generated from memory. So what you will be measuring today is looking at rankings, traffic, citations, if you are ahead of the curve. If nothing's getting cited, it's because it's not getting searched. So what do you measure instead? You track whether Claude can recall your own brand. You ask an unbranded category question and measure how often your name appears. That is very easy to do in a platform like Searchable, where you have many prompts. And as a part of our strategy, I recommend when we consult is 90% unbranded, 10% branded. If your branded questions will always elicit the brand. So rather go unbranded, and then you can look at your visibility, you can see what the recall like, and you can see how often your brand is being cited. And now we will get on to the interesting part, and I'm super excited about this because I'd seen in the chat that a lot of people had mentioned it, but cat's out of the bag. Claude runs on a different data retrieval than a lot of the LLMs that we use. And so Claude is using a search engine called Brave. I'm sure you've heard of it. If you haven't, this is Brave. Brave typically runs in-app. It's a very unique search engine compared to Google in the sense that it has its own API. So you can actually build you can query the API directly. And I did that, for this webinar. I used it for all the prompts that we ran, all the data sources that we checked. You can do that. And so when Claude is recommending brands, 63% of the time, those brands will be in Brave's top 10 results. Whereas when you're looking at Google, it's only 34% of the time. So almost double are coming from Brave's recognition of those. Why is it like that? Can't say for certain. There are certain features of overlap if you look at the different types of results. But Brave has its own features, it has its own algorithm. But the only thing you need to know is that if you really want to get featured in Claude, a big part of your strategy will be wanting to be featured on Brave. And I'm working on some research where I hope to publish exactly how that is possible, so that we can explore and widen open that up and widen that for everybody. When the two lists differ, Claude will look at Brave 6-1. So for all the brands that it finds, it'll be almost 6x compared to those found in Google. A large section of its results are coming from Brave. We know this. And it's not to say that in Google there will be more, and in Brave there will be less, but for the most part, it really runs to these true averages. Inside Brave's top 10, however, and I did mention this earlier, is that position does not necessarily matter. What we're seeing from the data is that Claude generally tends to grab those top 10 results from Brave as a set of results and then chooses to shuffle them against the relevancy of the prompt that's basically being measured. Whereas with ChatGPT, for instance, an AI mode and AI overviews, it really is broken down by position. And so the higher your position in Google, the higher your chance of being recommended by those engines. When it comes to Claude, and the position that it holds in Brave is not exactly the same. So you can see that we've broken down in the different ranks. The chance of being selected are pretty much, if not always equal, when widened out on a wide enough data set. So what we can take from this is that the site you can, and I will just say, getting featured in Brave, of course, is its own strategy, and that is a unique part of ranking in Claude and a unique part of the strategy. So in terms of how to get featured in Claude, you want to make sure that you have a strategy position for Brave. Once again, I am running some research and I hope to release that soon. And so I would love to send that to all of the participants on this webinar. We have your emails, but no promises. These things do take time. And so I'm just saying that's something that I'm actively invested in. So the site you control is the site that Claude may trust the least. A lot of people are looking at own media and saying, oh, I want to publish on our own website, etc. But for the most part, ChatGPT will reference your site up to 61% of the time. So the changes that you make when it comes to your product pages, your category pages, anything related to your business, if you would say in B2B SaaS, 61% of the time will be in your favor, as opposed to Claude that may be looking at your own website 32% of the time. Once again, this also highlights a point that working on your own website, of course, is important, but it's more important if you're trying to get featured in an engine like ChatGPT. And as we know, ChatGPT has over 1 billion monthly users. And so it's not a small pool of people that are using that engine. Claude would rather let someone else describe you, leaning heavily on its training data and what other people are saying about you, as opposed to people being able to sort of spam the results themselves. This is a tactic. If you are an SEO or have worked in search for a long time, you will have known that this is practically law in the search world. And so it is really an earned media engine and not an owned media engine. And that is one of the biggest takeaways from this webinar. On Claude, a page on your own domain is worth about half of what I mentioned on a site that Claude trusts is worth. And that reweights the whole plan. It's really less about polish out pages for the sake of showing up in LLMs, but more so polish our pages for the sake of having a clear brand that other people understand and choose to write about clearly. That is effectively the strategy that you want to be moving forward with. And so if you only did one thing today, and the biggest takeaway that you'll take from this is that if your first move is not to write, it is to be written about. And this, once again, comes down to a lot of things that we have explained in a lot of our webinars at Searchable, whether it's myself or Chris, or even on the AI Search Accelerator, which is the AI training course that we run, is that you really want to work on solidifying your brand, being good at understanding the digital footprint that your brand is left and how it's being described, and working on large, scalable solutions for basically having a strong brand and entity presence. Ultimately, you have to write less about yourself and get more written about you. Another thing to remember, because we do know that Claude does look at your website up to 32% of the time, as well as Brave, which of course has to look at it too. But the main takeaway here is a bit of traditional technical SEO is that if it can't be read, it can't be cited. Plenty of sites do fail that test. And there's no alarm when they do. So there's no alarm bells going off. It's really silent, and you likely would never know. And you actually have to be very careful. You can run the test now. If you know a site, for instance, Akamai, which is a CDN, they sometimes have a tendency to not be crawled in sometimes ChatGPT or Claude, but you can be very careful. You can ask, hey, can you read the site? And they'll say, yeah, I can read the site, sort of hallucinate a little bit. And then you'll say, no, actually go fetch the H1 from the source and tell me what it is. And they'll say, I can't do that. Why can't it do that? It's inherently been silently blocked. And so that is something that's super important. And you should check that against your own website right now. But if you're on a more modern CMS, it likely won't be the case. It's not that it'll drop in rank. Your website will just never appear. And that is even more damaging because you're basically just giving it to your competitors, or worse, to be forced to hallucinate about your brand. So you really don't want to do that. Claudebot does respect your robots.txt, and so it likely just will not crawl it. And if you have using a CDN like Cloudflare, Akamai, you can just block the bots, and you will never know that because it's on a prefetch rule. So effectively, you won't know. And if you're running a lot on JavaScript, Claude really won't pass that, as we know that AI mode and Google and Gemini is one of the only LLMs that does that. And so it's really important that you are using server-side rendering as a more technical factor, and of course, making sure that your CDN or any of these platforms are taken care of. What should you deprioritize in Claude? I'm aware we're coming up on time, so I'm going to sort of make it towards the end. Reddit, we know that Claude doesn't look at Reddit a lot, hardly ever cites it. It's been blocked and really just doesn't do it. It works on other engines like ChatGPT. And so, yeah, effectively, it's really not going to be a strategy for you there. Chasing a position inside page one, i.e. trying to gain Google or Brave. It's important always as good marketing to have great visibility and exposure. But if you're gaining position one for the sake of trying to show up in Claude or any LLM for that matter, it's not the move. And as we know from Brave, it pretty much treats the top 10 results as a single set, and then it decides to filter them based on the relevancy to the prompt. Leaning on your own website, as we saw through data, up to 32% of the time, Claude rely on owned media. For the most part, ChatGPT is an engine far more likely to read your own website. And if you're treating local as a web game, effectively trying to hack it, don't do that, because all of those pages and landing pages likely not going to get picked up the way that you intended. And Claude goes to a map, not the open web. So if it's going to choose to learn anything, it'll go through its own map mechanism that it's built, not through your own descriptors and sort of stuff that you have put on your own website. Does Claude name you on its own when nobody prompts it to? So you can really just determine this by asking non-branded category prompts. The instinct to ask, does Claude cite me? Half the time it's not citing anyone. It's just recalling. And so if you're looking at citations as a measure of AI success, it's really not going to be what you're looking for. It's not a valid metric. But your brand name being mentioned and having high visibility is a good metric. And so you can look at the memory, you can look at top brands in your particular category, as we mentioned prior. You can also look at non-branded prompts, which will then elicit certain brands. And when you start asking buying questions or a customer's question, the way that a customer would frame it, with no brand in it, let's see what sort of names come from that answer. And so this is super important. One run really is not enough. So you do need to run multiple prompts. This is how LLMs work for work, of course. For Claude, of course, it's a lot more smart. And so you can measure how often your brand appears. We do see brand changes pretty highly. Not to say that all the brands are basically being taken out, but for the most part, they will shuffle. Okay, so that is something to bear in mind. And so, for instance, even like within our own platform, it's important. We obviously run prompts many, many, many times to get the most valid and accurate measure. And of course, it is super important to do that. So here it says you can run the question 40 times and count how often it comes back. If you would like to do that manually, please go ahead. Of course, there are easier ways to do it. Our tool is one of those, and of course, whatever works for you time-wise. As a takeaway, on Google, you can earn a ranking, whereas on Claude, you can earn a reputation. I feel like that's a very Hollywood headline, and it's absolutely true. ultimately, it is about holistic marketing and branded presence. And as we saw, there are many other ways that you can determine it by looking at Brave, by testing the training memory, by looking at the category that you're in. These will all be very effective. And so blanket advice really doesn't work here. But when we get into the nitty gritty and we get very low level and granular, you will begin to understand how it matters to you and your business. And I highly advise after this talk that you go ahead and do that. If you would like to learn more about how to get featured on Claude, on ChatGPT, we run the AI Search Accelerator. This has really just been a snapshot today of Claude. Ultimately, we can provide a lot more value, and we do so over the AI Search Accelerator, which we run for several weeks, 5 to 6 weeks. I am an instructor. I've been working in search for over 12, maybe almost 13 years of my life now, from SEO to AEO, and we cover all these sorts of topics. If it's something that you may be interested in, you are welcome to join our AI Search Accelerator. We're doing 5 weeks, and we teach you how to build a strategy end to end for how to get featured, whether you want to be featured in Claude, ChatGPT, whatever the case may be, any engine that's important to you. We have 2 tracks, brand and agency. As you can see, we have some really prominent companies that have chosen to take the accelerator. H&M on brand side, as you can see for yourself, and on agency as well. And I've had the pleasure of connecting with some really talented people at these companies and work with them to work on AI search. It's been absolutely awesome, to say the least. And I really get into the AI Search Accelerator, pretty much built the whole thing with the very, very wonderful cohort team. And so if that's something you'd be interested in doing, please come along. You do need to be a customer of Searchable. It is a very small investment for the knowledge that you will gain, and I couldn't recommend it more. We will help you build and implement, do this sort of stuff. We run a live cohort. I will be there, sessions like this with myself. We also do Q&As where you can literally have your questions answered by myself, running these sorts of experiments. I have access to millions of prompts. Literally, so you just bring along your questions and can help you answer them. We provide on-demand modules so you can learn when I'm not there. We shoot a couple of them every single week. You can learn how to use the platform. We put it all through, walk you through the platform, teach you the strategies, and you also get access to our private workspace and community in Slack, where you can effectively speak to other people that are also in the AI Search Accelerator, share notes, share experiences, share strategies, real people that are also in the accelerator with you, invested, running agencies from big brands, etc., as you've seen on the slides that we had. And so you can go to searchable.com events, AI Search Accelerator. I can't see the chat, so I'm not sure if the team have basically put it in the chat, but the next cohort is kicking off on the 22nd of September. The slots do run out fairly quickly, so please go ahead and sign up. You will need to be a paying customer of Searchable. Like I said, you get access to everything here, knowledge from true experts. I never call myself an expert, but really great experts on the team. And I think will add a lot of value to your teams. So searchable.com/events/AI Search Accelerator. Go check it out. You don't want to miss this one. Yeah, you don't want to miss this one. This will be the 5th one. I've been personally involved in 1 to 4. It's pretty great. Yeah, and seen some really transformational stuff for the people that have joined. Literally people building agencies from the ground up, from zero to hero, so to speak. So we are coming up on time, and I wanted to thank you, everybody, for attending. Really enjoyed taking you through this today. I hope that it's been valuable. I just want to see if there's anything I need to be aware of. I can see that a lot of questions are coming in to the chat. I hope that you've been able to reflect and bounce off the other participants. Please go check out the Search Accelerator. I can see a lot of interest here. If you guys like this session, you're going to love the cohort. You're going to love the accelerator, trust me. And I will do everything I can to make it the best for you all. So thank you for attending. And this has been awesome. And it's been a pleasure to teach you how Claude works and how to get your brand featured in Claude. As always, we are here for you. So just reach out and catch me on LinkedIn, reach out to the team. And don't forget to check out the Search Accelerator if this was helpful to you and you think you would want to learn more and it would add value. With that, we'll take off and we will see you in the next one. Thank you, everybody.